As soon as it was morning, the chief priests with the elders and scribes and the whole council held a consultation, and they bound Jesus and led him away and delivered him to Pilate. And Pilate asked him, "Are you the king of the Jews?" And he answered him, "You have said so." And the chief priests accused him of many things. And Pilate again asked him, "Have you no answer to make? See how many charges they bring against you." But Jesus made no further answer, so that Pilate wondered. Now at the feast he used to release for them one prisoner for whom they asked. And among the rebels in prison who had committed murder in the insurrection, there was a man called Barabbas. And the crowd came up and began to ask Pilate to do as he was wont to do for them. And he answered them, "Do you want me to release for you the king of the Jews?" For he perceived that it was out of envy that the chief priests had delivered him up. But the chief priests stirred up the crowd to have him release for them Barabbas instead. And Pilate again said to them, "Then what shall I do with the man whom you call the king of the Jews?" And they cried out again, "Crucify him." And Pilate said to them, "Why, what evil has he done?" But they shouted all the more, "Crucify him." And so Pilate, wishing to satisfy the crowd, released for them Barabbas. And having scourged Jesus, he delivered him to be crucified. The soldiers led him away inside the palace, that is the praetorium, and they called together the whole battalion, and they clothed him in a purple cloak, and plaiting a crown of thorns, they put it on him. And they began to salute him, "Hail, King of the Jews!" And they struck his head with a reed and spat upon him, and they knelt down in homage to him. And when they had mocked him, they stripped him of the purple cloak and put his own clothes on him. And they led him out to crucify him. And they compelled a passerby, Simon of Cyrene, who was coming in from the country, the father of Alexander and Rufus, to carry his cross. And they brought him to the place called Golgotha, which means the place of a skull. And they offered him wine mingled with myrrh, but he did not take it. And they crucified him and divided his garments among them, casting lots for them to decide what each should take. And it was the 3rd hour when they crucified him. And the inscription of the charge against him read, "The King of the Jews." And with him they crucified 2 robbers, one on his right and one on his left. And those who passed by derided him, wagging their heads and saying, "Aha, you who could destroy the temple and build it in 3 days, save yourself and come down from the cross." And so also the chief priests mocked him to one another with the scribes, saying, "He saved others, he cannot save himself. Let the Christ, the King of Israel, come down now from the cross, that we may see and believe." And those who were crucified with him also reviled him. And when the 6th hour had come, there was darkness over the whole land until the 9th hour. And at the 9th hour, Jesus cried with a loud voice, "Eloi, Eloi, lama sabachthani," which means, my God, why hast thou forsaken me?" And some of the bystanders hearing it said, "Behold, he is calling Elijah." And one ran, and filling a sponge full of vinegar, put it on a reed and gave it to him to drink, saying, "Wait, let us see whether Elijah will come to take him down." And Jesus uttered a loud cry and breathed his last. The curtain in the temple was torn in two from top to bottom. And when the centurion who stood facing them saw that he thus breathed his last, he said, "Truly this man was the Son of God." This is the gospel of the Lord. You please be seated. Well, just a short reflection, as this is Holy Week. In many ways, that account can stand for itself, but it does raise for me quite a number of questions, actually. Whenever I read the accounts of Jesus' arrest, his trial, and his crucifixion, it's difficult not to think of it as a bit of a sort of a play, a passion play. Whenever, a sort of play, where people have their parts and their speeches all written out for them, and the whole thing is stage managed from beginning to end. It's difficult to shake that kind of way of looking at it. And it's hard not to think like that, because the Bible itself tells us that from the very start, Jesus' death and resurrection was all planned. I mean, the book of Revelation, chapter 13, verse 8, we're even told that Jesus was the Lamb who was slain from the foundation of the earth. In other words, right back before time began, if you like, then it was all planned. And so as we go from the fall onwards, right throughout the Old Testament and into the New, we find all kinds of references to the fact that this Messiah, this suffering servant, will be crucified, will suffer in some way. So in Genesis 3, we talk about his heel being bruised, even as he crushes the serpent's head, or in Isaiah 53 about the suffering servant who was pierced for our iniquities and transgressions, and then in Psalm 22 about how he is to be forsaken. And then into the New Testament, this talk of suffering and the cross intensifies, with Mary herself being told by Simeon, even as he lifts up the baby in the temple, he says to Mary that a sword will pierce your heart also. You are going to suffer because of what your son is going to go through. And so the shadow falls on the baby and it lengthens as you go into the New Testament. It reminds me of a picture or painting by Holman Hunt. Now, Holman Hunt is most famous for the picture of Jesus standing at the door and knocking and holding a lantern in his hand. Big favourite in the Victorian times. But he did another one which I think was just as good, and it's called The Shadow of Death. If you Google it, you'll see what it looks like. But it shows Jesus in this carpenter's shop, surrounded by all kinds of wood shavings and nails and hammer and a bench and all sorts of various works that he is in the process of finishing. And at one stage, because he is so tired, he stops to stretch his limbs. And as he does, he stretches out his arms like that. And as he does, the sun breaking in through the carpenter's shop casts a shadow on the wall. And the shadow is the shadow of the cross. And Mary, who's on her knees trying to pick something up, sees it in that moment and is horrified because she knows what is coming. So even then, before he even starts his ministry, the shadow of the cross falls on Jesus. And all the way through the Gospels, and see time and time again, Jesus says again that he must go to Jerusalem and be arrested and killed before rising again, and that this was his Father's will. And there are lots of other passages there where he hints at his death. I started the service with one when he says that when he is lifted up, in reference to the cross, when he is lifted up, he will draw all people to himself. And it's interesting to read the Gospels to see how many times he refers to his own death. And so when he's finally arrested and he's tried, you know that it's inevitable. He's going to die. And in fairness to Pilate, he tries hard to find him innocent. He even tries to set him free, as at that time of the year it was tradition to celebrate the Passover to set a prisoner free at the behest of the crowd. And he thinks, of course, that they're going to set Jesus free, but they don't. No, they want this Barabbas, who's an insurrectionist and a murderer. They want him free. And what's more, Jesus himself makes no effort to proclaim his own innocence. He doesn't say hardly anything. He just says very short answers, and lastly, he doesn't say anything at all. He remains silent. Like a sheep before its shearer is dumb, so he opens not his mouth, says Isaiah 53. And so the die is cast, and it all moves inexorably towards its bloody end. And so it's hard not to feel a sort of sense of pity for all those who are caught up in this drama. And I know that it's a favourite of a lot of people to say, poor Judas Iscariot. In John 17, verse 12, Jesus says, while I was with them, I protected them, talking about his disciples, and kept them safe by that name you gave me. None has been lost except the one doomed to destruction, so that the scripture may be fulfilled. And this seems to reinforce the whole idea that all Jesus was doing was acting out his part, that he had no choice. He had no choice. He was just a puppet, if you like. And the same too with Pilate's futile efforts. He was never going to succeed in letting Jesus go because it was all, we are given the sense, inevitable. It's in the script. And it seems that even Jesus is caught up in the same trap as he talks about how he wishes his cup be taken from him, but nevertheless not his will, but his Father's will be done. So they all seem to be people that are manipulated in some way. And so this raises all kinds of questions. What about free will? Did Pilate and Judas have no choice? Which seems cruel beyond. And what about Jesus himself? And what about us? Is what happens to us somehow part of God's plan? Are we acting out our parts in some great cosmic play that started at the beginning of time and will move to its end, its conclusion? Are we all we're doing is acting out the parts that are written down for us? Is that all we're doing? Are we all puppets? We have no choice. Well, a typical Anglican answer would be this: it's a mystery. We're stepping in a mystery here. Like the mystery of how God can be three persons and yet one God and yet three persons. And trying to explain such things will actually lead to greater problems and deeper mystery. But I think we can say something. First of all, Judas's betrayal and Pilate's cowardice are roundly condemned in the Bible, with Judas being singled out for particular contempt as the one who betrayed Jesus with, of all things, a kiss. Now, it hardly seems fair of God to punish someone who had no choice in the matter. God set him up, God arranged it. Why would God punish somebody who's only doing what he was inevitably going to do? That's the question we ask. But that does not sound like the God of love and mercy and justice that the whole of the Bible portrays. It conflicts with it. It's a kind of a disconnect somehow there. There's two sides of things, isn't it? How do they get together? They don't go together. They don't. But we do know, to quote Abraham in Genesis 18, that God of this world is one who will do what is right. And we have to lay that at his feet. Because there's no doubt that Judas and Pilate were both culpable for what they did, completely. The only inevitability about their catastrophic choices came from their own sinful character flaws. Judas was greedy, and Pilate just wanted a quiet life, even if it meant the death of an innocent man. Character flaws, as wide as the Grand Canyon. And the second thing to say is when water flows down a mountainside, it always finds a way down. It will always find a channel on which to run. If not one way, then another. When sin is active, as it was all through Jesus' life, it was inevitable, and in the end, it would get Jesus, because that's the way it flows. As long as he stayed in Galilee or Jerusalem, the Jewish authorities are bound to get him eventually, and he would not budge, because that's where he was called to go. And so they just bided their time. And when they discovered in Judas someone who they could exploit, well, they used him, because that's what sin does. It exploits. It kills, it destroys, it lies, it does anything. And they also manipulated Pilate. Instead of accusing Jesus of blasphemy, which would have been no interest at all to Pilate because it was outside his jurisdiction, instead they accused Jesus of treason. They said he was the king of the Jews. Well, that was enough for Pilate. That was treason. And in the end, death was inevitable. He had little choice. And rather than stick up for justice and what is true and right, he gives in to the crowd, because that's the easy way. Sin compromises, doesn't it? And then lastly, what we get of a sense in all this is no matter how terrible the circumstances of Jesus' suffering, and let's be clear, it was terrible. There's never a moment when you feel that God is not in control. For example, when Jesus refuses to defend himself, as I said, like a sheep before its shearers is dumb, it's not because he's helpless, but exactly the opposite. It's because he is the master of the situation. And it is Pilate and the Jewish leaders and everybody else that's on trial, not him. He rises above it with such dignity. Such dignity. control. And so as we look at the play, which is our lives as Christians, as believers, we must always remember two things: that God is in control no matter what the situation looks like around us, no matter how bad it is. God is in control. He will have his will and his way in the end. That's what it's moving towards. Read the book of Revelation, and you will see how the story ends. You know, we can play along with him, and we can work with him, and we can do our own thing, and we know exactly where that ends. We have been warned. But ultimately, we know the ending. And it's this: good triumphs and evil is defeated. Revelation 22:21. I saw a new heaven, a new Jerusalem coming down from heaven like a bride prepared for her husband. And when it comes down, what happens? There's no more pain, no more suffering, no more death. You know, God will be their people, and God will be their God, and they will be his people. And there's this new heaven and this new earth. That's the way it ends. It doesn't look like it now. It certainly didn't look like it for Jesus at the time. Everything seemed to be going completely wrong and unraveling. But we then see, don't we, on Easter Sunday, this breaking through of God's life into the world, where Jesus, who was dead, rises again, and now we have hope in him. And we hang on to that no matter what goes wrong around us. Why? Because we know that God is in control. Death is not the final word. He's triumphed over death and evil and sin. He conquers. God wins because he's in control, and it's all the way through, from the beginning to the end. So let's take courage from that, even though in this darkest of times, even when on Good Friday everything seems to go wrong, we know what's good about Friday is that God is in control, and Jesus will win in the end. Amen.